Good evening, everyone. I think we're just going to slowly start. I see some people are still coming in. That's completely fine. Find a place, hang your coats. I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Simone Peek. I'm a journalist, and I'll be your host this evening. And we will be talking about welfare chauvinism. And I have to admit that until I was invited tonight, this concept was not known to me. But when I heard it, I immediately understood what this newly published research by Assistant Professor Gianna Maria Eijk is about. Because it's the cries that foreigners are coming for our social housing, they're coming for our healthcare and our social benefits, and we hear it every now and then. And do you notice how I say our? Because in chauvinism, there's an us and a them, and one, has a right to something and the other doesn't. And welfare chauvinism is about the desire of the so-called native citizens to exclude migrants from social safety nets. And this is the subject on which Gianna wrote the monograph Welfare Chauvinism in Europe, How Education, Economy and Culture Shapes Public Attitudes. You can see it here. I started working on her ideas almost 7 years ago already, and she's been thinking about the subject even longer than that. She's been interested in and passionate about the topic of migration and welfare for years. On the one hand, it's because she grew up with the support of social assistants, social housing, and social workers herself, and she's seen from up close the way newcomers are treated by majority groups that lived there before. And later on, she has lived and worked in 6 different countries. She wrote to me, she said, "These experiences convinced me early on that governments strongly influence the life experiences of and solidarity between different groups in society." And in fact, she wrote most of the book during her time in the United Kingdom, where discourses around welfare chauvinism are very present, and especially in the Brexit context. In her preface, she states, "Mainstream parties are often co-responsible for creating environments of public discontent, leading to the election successes of welfare chauvinists, radical right parties, and this is about to get worse," she notes, "as the recent rise of radical right parties across Europe is likely to reinforce these problems." So this is a real hot topic that we're discussing tonight, and we'll be hearing about the research, but Ms. Eijk realized she's not the only scholar contributing knowledge to this subject, and has thus invited 3 excellent speakers to complement this evening. We'll be hearing from Hein de Haas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and he's an extraordinary professor of migration and development at the University of Maastricht. He's one of the leading experts on the subject of migration, and I do not have time to mention all of his accomplishments, but I will say he recently published a new book, which is called How Migration Really Works. After that, we'll turn to Benjamin Leruth. He's an assistant professor in politics and society at the Universiteit of Groningen. Sorry, mixing up languages here. And he specializes in comparative welfare policy, long-term politics, democratic innovations, Euroscepticism, and the differentiation of European Union. And then before we'll finally turn to you at the end of their lectures, which will last about 10 minutes each, we will hear from Femke Roosma. Actually, it will be the other way around, but she specializes in welfare state legitimacy, the deservingness of beneficiaries, and universal basic income. She holds a Den L chair at the University of Amsterdam's Faculty of Social Behavioral Sciences, and she's an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Tilburg. But first, please give a warm applause for Gianna Maria Eijk. She's assistant professor in political science at the University of Amsterdam, and she's about to speak about her new research.
Yes, hello everyone. Many thanks, Simone, for the kind introduction, and for all of you for being here in person and also online. It means really a lot to me. It means a lot because the topics we're going to discuss impact many people's lives, including my own, maybe some of yours too. So I hope that my book can inspire some critical discussions about welfare chauvinism and related topics. I want to thank everyone who supported me on this book journey. So many of them are mentioned in the acknowledgements of the book, and I also do not have time to mention them all right now. But today I want to particularly thank the SPAO team, especially Fatima, for organizing this event with me, to Benjamin, Femke, Hein, and also to you, Simone, for speaking with me on stage. And also thanks to the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Science and the Amsterdam Research Center for Migration at the University of Amsterdam for granting me financial support to organize this event. Okay, so this is where the story begins. What is welfare chauvinism and why the focus on Europe? Historically, European governments have been spending more and more of their budgets on the welfare state, including social benefits like social assistance, unemployment benefits or pensions, and also social services like education, childcare, or active labor market integration policies. And in some countries, the public social spending makes up around 1/3 of the GDP. Even though some European welfare states have recently been suffering from budget cuts, welfare states here are still relatively generous in comparison to other continents. And Europe is also the continent with the highest levels of migration. And on the one hand, one could say that high levels of migration and high levels of welfare generosity are the perfect recipe for welfare chauvinism, particularly in times of crisis when existential fears among the public are often on the rise. Welfare chauvinism has first been introduced in the academic literature over 3 decades ago by Jørgen Goul Andersen and Torg Bjørklund in the context of progressive parties in Denmark and Norway. There have been slightly different definitions of what welfare chauvinism exactly means, and similar terms have also been introduced to literature like welfare nationalism and selective solidarity. But in the end, these terms all refer to the same issue, granting welfare to natives and not to people with migration or minority backgrounds. Or in other words, welfare for us and not for them. Nowadays, welfare chauvinism is at the heart of political conflicts, also beyond the European continent. And what is important to know is that welfare chauvinism has long been a winning formula for the right wing, but it's also present in the left part of the political spectrum. So just to be very clear, the problem here is not that migrants pose a burden to the welfare systems. This is actually not in line with the facts. The problem is that particularly in contexts of welfare cuts and marketization of social services in some countries, migrants are used as scapegoats to deflect from larger societal, political, and economic problems. And here are some examples of welfare chauvinism from well-known news outlets. So first, welfare chauvinism in parties. In 2022, Politico reported that the German opposition leader Friedrich Merz accused Ukrainian refugees of welfare tourism, of taking advantage of the German social welfare system by seeking protection in the country, collecting benefits, and then returning to Ukraine. Welfare chauvinism in policies. In 2021, NOS reported that between 2015 and 2020, over 1,000 children of victims of the childcare allowance scandal in the Netherlands were unnecessarily taken away from their parents and placed in care. And we know that in this context, people with double nationality or foreign names were singled out and over-proportionately discriminated against. And finally, welfare chauvinism in publics. In 2019, the Financial Times reported about yet another Brexit demonstration, and we know that one of the main motivations for Brexit support amongst the public was to keep migrants, particularly workers from Eastern Europe, out of the country due to fears that they take advantage of the benefits and services in the UK. The main focus of my book is to understand what the public really thinks about social benefits and services for people with migration background, and why should we even care about what the public thinks? So to make it short, it's important for democratic representation to understand what the public wants from their representatives and why. And usually attitudes are far more complex than we assume. So for my analysis, I included data from around 500,000 Europeans over the past 3 decades, and I looked at what they think about welfare states using surveys that allow us to generalize the findings to the European public. Particularly, the European Social Survey includes a clear question about welfare chauvinism, and the question is, thinking of people coming to live in your country from other countries, when do you think they should obtain the same rights to social benefits and services as citizens already living here? Immediately on arrival, say 8%. After a year, whether or not they have worked, say 9%. After they worked and paid taxes at least a year, say 42%, the majority. But right after, 31% say, once they have become a citizen, and 10% say they should never get the same rights. People who choose one of these last 2 answers, so over 40% of the European population, are what I define in my book as welfare chauvinists. I've also interviewed people in focus groups and analyzed focus group data across Europe, and the results are similar. So no matter what kind of data we use, the most important criteria for welfare access for migrants and refugees appears to be working and paying taxes, hence reciprocity. So, but now when we look at these results across countries, we can see that there are large variations from around 20% in Spain to 60% in Russia. Here I highlighted the Netherlands, where we have one of the most welfare chauvinist publics in Europe, with more than half of the public saying that newcomers should only receive access to welfare after becoming citizens or not at all. When we look at the development of welfare chauvinism across the past 2 decades, we can see that welfare chauvinism has on average declined, but only 3%. And in some countries, welfare chauvinism has also increased, for example, in the Netherlands, with an increase of 3%. And with my dear colleague Christian Albrecht Larsen from the University of Aalborg in Denmark, I collected new survey data in Denmark, Germany, and the UK, and we asked specifically about social benefits and services for Eastern European workers, and we zoomed into specific social policies. And the results show that welfare chauvinism also varies across policies. For example, welfare chauvinism in relation to school education is below 20%, but almost the double, close to 40%, when it comes to social assistance. And I find over 70% opposition when it comes to child benefits that are transferable across the EU. So generally, the public appears more supportive when it comes to social services and less supportive when it comes to social benefits. And amongst others, this is because social services are connected to local labor market integration, and for newcomers, they can also be seen as a means for cultural integration. My book also looks into which subgroups in societies are particularly welfare chauvinist. One of the biggest claims in social science has been for over a century now that highly educated people are more tolerant when it comes to different issues, such as democracy, diversity, migration, and also welfare for newcomers, because higher educated people are assumed to have better labor market positions, and higher education is assumed to transfer more tolerant norms to its participants. Reports from the 2017 elections in the Netherlands argued that education level is the biggest predictor for support for Geert Wilders, and I've seen similar reports for other elections around the world, and also the November 2023 elections in the Netherlands. With headlines like this, it can feel like lower educated people are almost blamed for their attitudes because the focus is not on the underlying inequalities that lead to these attitudes. And so I critically analyzed whether welfare chauvinism really only exists amongst the lower educated people in society. And the answers in my book, the answer in the book is clearly a no. So yes, in most countries, the lower educated, here defined as people without a tertiary education degree, are a little more welfare chauvinist than the higher educated, 6% on average. But on average, even more than 1 in 3 people with tertiary education are also welfare chauvinist, 1 in 3. According to this representative survey data. And this varies also from country to country. So in some countries, it's actually the higher educated that are more welfare chauvinist than the lower educated. And here I highlighted again the Netherlands, where I find almost no differences between people with or without a tertiary education degree. And finally, my book also focuses on the interplay between education, economy, and culture. And across countries, time, and social policies, higher levels of education do not automatically relate to lower levels of welfare chauvinism. In fact, the education effect can disappear in national contexts with precarious economies and right-wing cultures. Basically, everyone can have economic fears in society, and everyone is socialized into certain norms of the society they grew up in. This shows migration and lower levels of education are not the root of all problems, and it's important that we shift our focus to institutions and those who shape them to understand growing polarization and inequality in society, instead of blaming individuals, particularly if they're already vulnerable in vulnerable positions in society. And to come to the end, welfare chauvinism has become increasingly normalized in certain countries, in particular cash-benefit chauvinism. We see the scapegoating of migrants, particularly in times of economic crisis and in context of right-wing mobilization. Investments in social services could be a way forward for a more united society, but only if these policies become more inclusive, since migrants and lower educated people are often discriminated against when it comes to these types of policy. And also the social dimension of the European Union, Social Europe, could play a role here, since the European Union makes some efforts to strengthen social services, but this may require the EU to adjust its negative rhetoric on migration, and in particular on non-EU migration. Yes, that's all for now. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much. Gianna, I will invite to the stage Hein de Haas, who will talk about the origins of welfare chauvinism. Please give him an applause.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Gianna with a fantastic book. I think it is a groundbreaking book in many ways. You question a lot of common assumptions in this whole debate. I think it is really required reading, not only for academics, but also for people in the policy field. So I really hope lots of your work gets bigger exposure also beyond the ivory tower. What I particularly appreciated is how you shatter almost the myth that education, as you say, it will liberate us. This idea that if people get better access to information, get higher educated, this welfare chauvinism will disappear. And as you showed in the graphs already, the differences are actually very small. I mean, there are some differences, but it is actually quite small. And most of the differences, both within countries and across countries, cannot be explained by that. I think the other thing that you shouldn't underestimate is that immigration levels don't matter that much. There are some countries in the high welfare chauvinist category that actually have low migration and high migration. because there is a naive idea around that the higher the immigration, the higher the opposition to immigration, or indeed the higher the welfare chauvinism, and we don't see these easy links. And you rightly argue, I think, in the end of your book and also at your presentation, that this is the responsibility of governments, because they have the power to shape public attitudes. So here we talk just not about governments, I think, but about politicians who espouse particular rhetorics that actually reproduce this idea. And that brings me back to my main commentary or question. Where do these attitudes originate from in the first place? When I did some background research on this broader idea of the welfare magnet where you talk about, I discovered that actually Milton Friedman, the famous or infamous free market economist, already gave a speech in the 1970s where he said, the best migrant is the illegal migrant. And he meant it as a provocation. He said, undocumented migrants, they work hard. They don't have access to any social services, but they do pay taxes. He actually didn't make a plea against migration, he made a plea against social welfare in the first place. And he said, migration is not a problem if we don't have a welfare state. But he was, as far as I could trace it back, the first sort of intellectual that made that link somehow, that the welfare state is not compatible with immigration or with free or high migration, whatever way you call it. Then a famous American migration economist, George Borjas, took this over and published some articles in mainstream journals as well, where he made this link, but he did not make a plea for less welfare, but for less immigration. So he solidified this idea, and also academically he put this idea of the welfare magnet, which in the Dutch context translates to the aanzuigende werking, this idea of the sucking in effect of welfare states, and that if there's too many migrants, we'll undermine the welfare state. Now, as you mentioned yourself in your book, now by the way, what is also interesting, if you look at who mainstreamed this in politics, for instance, Tony Blair was very important in the British context to mainstream this idea. He was the first talking about asylum seekers like welfare scroungers. It wasn't actually Margaret Thatcher, it was Tony Blair. So there are quite some politicians on the left. Jean-Michel Rocard in France did actually the same already back in the 1980s. The topic seems to have been taken over by the right and the far right. They've become the issue owner, but you mentioned it as well. It's not just a left-right-wing issue. So when we look at the evidence, there is no evidence that there is a welfare magnet. There is no evidence that immigration brings down the welfare state, if we look at the fiscal effects, as economists would call it, and you also mentioned that. But then still a substantial share of the public seems to believe this to be the case, that welfare is immigration is a threat to the welfare state. And it begs the question, why? I mean, there are two possible explanations. It's either people's direct experiences, and I think the notion that migration is experienced not on the national level, because whatever economists may find, that there is no strong effect of immigration on welfare. If you live somewhere where lots of migrants or asylum seekers may happen to live on welfare, you may get this impression. This is generally the case for immigration. And the other is political rhetoric, the welfare scrounger rhetoric, which has become very strong. And this seems to be substantiated by, the last hypothesis seems to be substantiated by your own findings that show there is no huge difference between higher and lower educated, and that the national context actually seems to matter most, if that's a correct conclusion I can draw from your work. And in addition, also very interestingly, attitudes haven't worsened, remarkably stable, and for most countries, actually gone a little bit more positive. So welfare chauvinism is not on the increase, whilst immigration is clearly on the increase. And it doesn't fit comfortably with the classic hypothesis, what would drive welfare chauvinism. And I think here there's a parallel with attitudes on migration more in general. People find this very hard to believe, but despite the election victory of far right-wing parties in Europe, public attitudes towards migration in general haven't really shifted in a more negative direction. In most countries, they've moved the other way. For instance, ESS data shows that if people have to answer the question, does immigration make the Netherlands a better place to live, that in 2002, 30% said yes, and in 2022, 53% said yes. So this sounds very paradoxical. So it seems that the far right has been very effective in accessing the share of population that already had negative opinions about these issues, rather than that actually public opinion has shifted. And that actually brings me to the question, because you somehow seem to suggest, I think of very much I like the nuance and the distinction you made between social services and benefits. But it makes me actually think, is the right response really then to change the way we organize social security, or should the emphasis indeed more be about educating the public? Or is that an illusion given the fact that you have found that education is not liberation? I don't have the answer. I hope you have it. Thank you.
Thank you. Femke Roosma will be speaking about deservingness. Please give her an applause.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Jana, for inviting me. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you too, because I think you wrote a great book, very interesting book, and I think that the audience should all read it. So I highlighted like 3 reasons why this book is great and why you should read it. First, and that's I think already mentioned by Hein, and I think also Jana advocated for that. That it covers a very relevant topic, right? So we see in European a lot of geopolitical pressures on the one hand, the rise of the radical right on the other hand, and the welfare state is somehow squeezed in between. And I think welfare chauvinism is a very important concept to help to understand what is going on there. So the topic is very, very relevant. Second, it teaches us as well that we should not talk about welfare chauvinism in generalizations and in stereotypes. And I think that's also something that Jana just shared with you, that it's like much more nuanced, that we should not say the lower educated are the most welfare chauvinist. No, it depends on context, it depends on economy, it depends on culture. And I think that book advocates for this as well. And finally, and this is also from an academic point of view, I think the book offers a very rich picture of welfare chauvinism. So it's, Jana takes a lot of effort in explaining all types of explanations for the findings that she presents. She also analyzes the data in very different ways and approaches it in very different ways, and binds that together in very attractive and important conclusions. So yes, if you're interested, read the book or buy the book. I don't know. I'm not the I'm not the publisher, but it's very well. A very, very great work. So congratulations on that again. Then I wanted to focus a little bit on chapter 6, and that's the chapter where Jana shows that welfare chauvinism differentiate across policies, across social policies, and she also showed a figure for that. And I think that's a very important and very relevant chapter. And she already showed the graph that when it comes to social services, about 25% of the people say, okay, here we want to exclude migrants. Well, it comes to like cash benefits for children and taking that abroad to the country of origin, it's about 75%. So that's a big difference, and I think that it shows that welfare chauvinism is not simply an anti-immigrant attitude, but that's a welfare attitude too. So that's also about what kind of social policies do we want to give immigrants access to, and I think that's important to realize. One of the important nuances that you show in your book, and that we should consider when we talk about welfare chauvinism and migration, as it differs substantially across policies. Second, according to Europeans, welfare beneficiaries should be within borders. So I think that in the figure that she shows, that the policies that people are the most critical about are the policies where people could take cash benefits to their country of origin. So that's something that we really do not want here. So it really shows that welfare is still a national affair, and that people, if you want to organize the welfare state, it should be within the borders. So that's, I think, an important conclusion. And the third one, and I think I will say a little bit more about that as well, in relation to my own research, is that social investment services are less vulnerable for welfare chauvinism than cash benefits. So that's what the figure clearly shows. When it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, we are much more willing to grant immigrants social rights, social benefits, than when it comes to cash benefits like social assistance, but also childcare benefits, which are universal benefits. So in social policy literature, we always assume that universalism, like granting everybody the same, would raise legitimacy. But I think that you show that's not really about the universalism, but it's about the services element, right? So, and that's something different, and that also learns us something about social policy, and I will say that a little bit more about that in a minute. So these are, I think, very interesting conclusions, and they relate also to what I study, and that's welfare deservingness. And that's so that's part of a bigger theory that relates to deservingness of beneficiaries of social policy, but also migrants. And the main question that deservingness theory tries to answer is who deserves what, of who should be deserving of benefits, of solidarity. And we used to consider social groups like the elderly, like sick and disabled, unemployed, but also migrants. And you can also think of different groups within these broader categories. So think of different groups of migrants who are more and less deserving. And to explain that, we usually use the so-called deservingness criteria. They have the very, I don't know, a little bit strange acronym CADIN, so we use some CADIN criteria as well. But there are 5 criteria that we use to judge whether or not we find certain groups or certain people deserving. And the first criterion is control, that's hence the C. We think that people are more deserving if we believe that they are not to blame for the situation in which support is needed. So if you get, for instance, unemployed beyond your own fault, we are much more willing to grant you a benefit than when you just, when you're fired for cause, for instance. So also in relation to welfare chauvinism, this is an important criteria. Do you come here because you have no other choice if you're a refugee, or do you have a choice? So this element of control is important. Gratitude or attitude is the second one, is also important. So people who are more grateful or more compliant are considered to be more deserving. The third one is actually the most important, I think, in this case. I will say a little bit more about that as well. So if people reciprocate or have contributed in the past or will do so maybe in the future, we are likely to consider them more deserving. So reciprocity is a very important element. Then we have identity. In the case of migration, this is also, of course, very relevant. We're more likely to be tolerant or solidaristic with people who are of our own kind or close to us. So in thinking about refugees from maybe Ukraine compared to the refugees from the Middle East, you can see this identity criterion play out very strongly. But it also is closer to home, so we're more likely to be solidaristic towards elderly because they're closer to us. Because we all know elderly people, and that's somewhat different than people on social assistance, for instance. And also need is very important, so the degree to which support is needed. So if people are very needy, we're more likely to give them benefits or support them. So these are the 5 criteria, and I think they play a role in your book, in welfare chauvinism. First, you show, I think, that there's more welfare chauvinism in unemployment and social assistance benefits. So, like I said, here people maybe have, people think that they can find a job easy, or maybe go back to their home country to find a job. So, in terms of unemployment benefits and social assistance benefits, people are much more welfare chauvinistic. You also show that reciprocity is important in the sense that for cash benefits, people are more chauvinistic than with regard to social services. And that's because, and I will say a little bit more about it as well, because with cash benefits it's much more clearer. So I pay taxes and somebody else gets it, but what does this person do in return? It's much less clear than, for instance, services, which are less clear linked to what we pay in. I think you also show that need is important in the sense that there's less welfare chauvinism in provisions that address basic human needs, like healthcare. It's only 25% of the people say, no, migrants should not have access to healthcare. So that's, I think, a relatively small percentage compared to the other provisions, and that has to do with need. And it also has to do with identity, I think, then, so excluding people. So yes, identity is important, so this small group of 25% then excludes people even from healthcare, so that's quite harsh, I could say. But that's in the identity criteria, right? So here we show that it's not our kind of people, but that's relatively small compared to the bigger group. And then there was one puzzling finding from deservingness theories that child benefits are not that popular to grant to migrants. While in the literature we assume that children are very deserving because they are not in control, they're probably very needy, cannot take care of themselves. But here we show that Jana shows that the child benefits are not that popular. And that's, I think, because they're cash benefits, like Jana is also concluding from her chapter. And cash benefits probably maybe are assumed to go to parents and not to children. So that's again an interesting finding. I think that is about cash instead of services, because childcare services are much more popular, or we're much more likely to grant immigrants social rights to that. So coming back to this idea of reciprocity and that being very important, I was thinking about a research together with two colleagues, Thierry Cochet and Koen Abts, who studied radical right voters in Flanders in Belgium, and looked into discourses that they use to exclude migrants from the welfare state. And they show that first there's two types of discourses. First, there's welfare chauvinism, that really wants to exclude people from the welfare state because they are migrants. So there's the identity criteria is very important here, and I put here in quote, it's like illustrative of the type of discourses that are used by these voters. All migrants out, only Belgium, only then Belgium will be Belgium again. The government needs to give our own people jobs so that there's again money for our own kind of people. So really, migrants should go out. But we discovered also another type of discourse, which we called welfare producerism. And that's people who want to exclude migrants from the welfare because they feel migrants do not contribute or reciprocate enough. So this is really about reciprocity and about control. So doing something in return. So also here we have a quote that was illustrative for the type of discourse that we found. For instance, I have a very strong sense of justice. I find that all migrants have the same opportunities as we do. If people work and pay taxes like everyone else, I have absolutely no problem. But often I get the impression that Belgium is like a honeypot. They all come, stick around, and live as parasites on welfare. So this is also this is radical right voters, right? But this is like a very different type of discourse, which is really about doing something in return. And it's really about reciprocating. So that's completely, or not completely, somewhat different than identity, I think. So, and then finally, I want to share some recent research, quantitative research we did that shows how people distinguish between groups we are solidaristic with, so differentiating in solidarity. And this research shows that we, since 1999, so since 2 decades, we are differentiating more in solidarity between, on the one hand, people and groups we find very deserving, like the elderly and the elderly and the sick and disabled. We find them very deserving, and unemployed and migrants we find less deserving. And we see that these groups are drifting apart in terms of our solidarity. And the important reason for that, or the underlying mechanism for that, is that reciprocity has become more important. As an explanation. So we find reciprocity more important, that's why we distinguish more between these groups. And we find that in social policies that are more universal, so more for everybody, we differentiate more, and that's something that we didn't expect. But at the same time, we see that reciprocity in countries where there are more universal policies that benefit more people is less important. So this is some puzzling result. And then I thought, here's the answer in Jana's book, and that's about social services. So maybe it's not about universality, but it's about the services that we provide, because maybe these services can reduce differences in solidarity between migrants and other groups, because so Jana gives 4 reasons in her book, and also in another paper with Christian Albrecht Larsen. She says there's some reservingness-related reasons, so there's a weaker imagined giver-receiver link in services, so less violation of the perceived reciprocity principle, but also social investment services are something investing in people that can reciprocate later. So there's also the reciprocity argument, but then if you invest in people now, here in for instance, schooling and in childcare, they can do something in return later in life for our society. So here the deservingness elements, I think, are very strong. And then also she provides 2 other reasons that go beyond deservingness, I think. For instance, the consumption of services can only take place in the country of destination. So people are afraid that people take money back to their home country, but healthcare you can only consume in this context, in this country. Same for schooling, same for childcare. And I think that's also a very interesting reason or explanation. And then Jana mentions finally also that services in general are less easy to abuse. Like, so for instance, if I give you money, I'm not sure what you're going to do with it, but if I give you healthcare, it's much clearer that you use it to get better or get care. So they're much less easy to abuse services. So I think that these results are very interesting also for welfare policies and solidarity in a broader sense, and that maybe investing in universal services rather than maybe universal basic income, like some would argue, is the way forward to bring people together and to enhance more legitimacy for the welfare state, including migrants. Finally, Jana, thank you. Congrats with a great book, and thank you for listening.
I want to invite to the stage Benjamin Laruth, who will be speaking on welfare policy opposition, and I'm going to invite you two to the stage later.
Thank you very much, Jana, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming to celebrate Jana's book as well. It's a wonderful book. If you are looking for someone to criticize the book, you will not find anyone here on stage because it's a really, really good one. I will first move on. Yes, so if I was to use a sentence to kind of try and summarize what this book is all about, it would actually be like using an expression that is book related, which is never judge a book by its cover. And I think that the book also draws very nice conclusion about the fact, the stereotypes, as the other speakers mentioned earlier, the fact that it's not because people have a lower level of education that they are more welfare chauvinistic. Never judge a book by its cover. It's also an expression that I use quite a lot in my work, and I complement this by saying judge it by its conclusion. And that's what I've been asked, actually, to review within the framework of this launch. So, chapter 7, which is a conclusion, an original piece that I find particularly strong because, as we would expect of all strong policy-related books, you need to not only tie all the findings of your research, but you also need to explain what are the what we can do with the research that has been done. What policy implication can we have, and how can we solve the problems that are being caused by welfare chauvinism? In case you need a reminder, and this is really well tied together in chapter 7, Jana's book focuses on 3 research questions. The first one is, what are the levels of welfare chauvinism across countries, time, and social policies in Europe? And she does demonstrate, as it has been mentioned earlier, that welfare chauvinism indeed varies between places and between policies. The second core research question is, how do these attitudes vary among different socioeconomic status groups, particularly educational groups? And as you know, we should not judge a book by its cover here. The third question is how do national economic and cultural contexts shape socioeconomic cleavages on welfare chauvinism. And she does realize, she does identify the fact that there are a lot of variation between countries as far as welfare chauvinistic attitudes are concerned. Now, I'm not going to summarize the conclusion. I would like to invite you all to do this, but I'd like also to show with this figure that is present in the conclusion that Jana goes beyond analyzing welfare chauvinism. She also focuses on redistributive policies, and this graph here shows the variation in opposition towards a redistributive policy measure on the EU level amongst the tertiary educated in comparison with non-tertiary educated, and you see that there's a strong variation once again per country. So now I'd like to invite you to zoom out a little bit, and that also gives me the opportunity to present other works published by Jana. I had the chance of co-editing a forthcoming special issue in the Journal of European Social Policy on a concept that we call welfare policy opposition. And we argue that welfare chauvinism is one element, one form of welfare policy opposition. In the special issue, we introduce the notion and we define it as an umbrella term covering different forms of protest towards existing policies financed by governments. And we do identify that there are three dominant policy paradigms that fall within this framework. You'll guess one of them for sure. It's obviously welfare chauvinism. But there's another one as well that is used in the existing literature, and it's the concept of welfare populism. The third and final one, and this has been investigated in Jana's most recent work, is the concept of welfare Euroscepticism. Allow me for a few minutes to explain to you what these different forms of welfare policy opposition entail. First of all, you should know that when it comes to welfare policies, there's a supply side, with politicians mostly, and a demand side from the voters. I'm mostly going to focus on the demand side, also because I want to wrap things up quickly so that you can ask your questions. So, as far as welfare chauvinism is concerned, in our most recent research, we identified the fact that politicians use different forms or shades, if I may say, of welfare chauvinism. In their manifestos and speeches, we see a form of temporary welfare chauvinism sometimes, when politicians want to focus on delaying access to benefits and services. This is very much linked to the question of the European Social Survey presented by Jana earlier. The second one is selective chauvinism, where we make a difference in access to benefits and services based on the citizen's legal status. Consider a refugee versus an EU citizen, for instance. The third version of welfare chauvinism is functional chauvinism, where there is a variation per policy, and this is very well illustrated in Jana's book. The fourth one is cultural chauvinism, and in this form, politicians would argue that access to benefits and services should be conditioned to demonstrating that you are well integrated culturally, for instance, through a citizenship test or a language test. And the final one, which only exists in fiction, fortunately, it's unconditional welfare chauvinism, where there is no access forever to non-natives. Yet, we have to mention it in these ideal types. I'll move on quickly about welfare populism. How can we define it and how does it differ from welfare chauvinism? So welfare populism is a form of opposition to welfare policies that do not benefit the common people and blames elites for not caring about those in need. And here, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the literature on populism. You have this, the pure people versus the corrupt elite argument that was popularized by Carl Schmoede. It's often used by populist radical right parties to blame the fact that the elites, the administrators, the government are not doing what they should do in order to care for the common man. It's often used by newcomer and outsider parties as well, not necessarily from the radical right. And it is often combined also with forms of welfare chauvinism that target migrants. Here the focus is not so much on migrants. Last but not least, welfare Euroscepticism, which I suspect, no pressure, may be the subject of another book by Jana in a few years' time. A concept that she came up herself, actually, with herself. Its opposition to welfare efforts at the European Union level, including redistribution. Think of the graph that I showed you a little bit earlier. And it is particularly salient as the idea of social Europe comes back at the center of the European arena. It's worth keeping an eye also on instances of welfare Euroscepticism in political discourse in the context of the upcoming European Parliament elections. It might come up. And I invite you to read Jana's most recent article on the topic. It's open access. So, very quickly, because I'm cautious of the time, why should we care about welfare policy opposition? Why should Beyond the Ivory Tower care about the impact that welfare policy opposition has? Firstly, it exacerbates and fosters new socioeconomic cleavages and inequalities in the society, more polarization as well. Secondly, it is really short-sighted. It is all about, from the politician's perspective, making electoral gains in the short run. But there are some creeping crises. Think of the aging population that need to be addressed. Migrants can be a solution to the aging population, and this is far too often ignored. The third one is that it's a very simple argument, a powerful argument, if I may say, that resonates with disgruntled voters as well. The system doesn't work, I oppose it, and I recognize myself in these forms of opposition. So addressing welfare policy opposition would require political courage, because unfortunately we do see a lot of parties trying to copy the strategies, especially the welfare chauvinistic strategies of opposite radical right parties, because it attracts voters. But again, this is a short-sighted vision of politics. I'd like to conclude this presentation with the very final paragraph in Jana's book, which I think sounds nice and can foster really like the discussion that is coming. This book shows that there is hope for the future of European welfare states in a globalized world, with policy choices that support solidarity, inclusion, diversity, and sustainable investment in individuals. More generous welfare and increasing levels of migration are compatible. So again, while this book may sound gloomy about welfare chauvinism, you should not judge it by its cover. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That was a great addition. I'm going to welcome to the stage Femke and Hein. Please join me. I'm going to do something a little bit scary. Yes, I did it. And try and find the first slide again. Oh, you already did it. Thank you. Before we go to you, I'd like to pose one question to Jana, which was actually mentioned by Hein, who said, why isn't education an indicator? And can't education be improved?
Yes, thank you so much, the three of you, for these wonderful presentations. Really great summaries also of parts of the books. And so, yes, why is education not necessarily a solution? And yes, so in the book, I also talk about the neoliberalization of higher education, because nowadays education is not necessarily about teaching tolerant norms to the students. Maybe some degrees don't include any teaching about values. Think about a mathematics degree. And so if society and governments push more and more for higher education to produce strong labor market participants and not give the students the time and the resources to really learn to critically think, then education is maybe not a solution. So when I say, I mean, I think, and I also write about it, that I think education can be changed. And when I write about more investments in quality services, then I also mean education, of course. So education from the get-go, early childhood education, to school education, to university education. There should be more investment in these policies, but what happens now is that a lot of the policymakers and politicians decide to just increase the levels of education in general, so more and more students or young people, more and more young people should go to university and get a degree, but it's not so much about the inclusion of social mobility, so these are often trade-offs that policymakers and politicians make. So often they're also realistically seen not enough resources to spend on everything at the same time. So often what we see in Europe, for example, is investment in more and more education, but at the cost of social mobility, just as an example. And that includes, of course, also migrants or more inclusion in general.
Maybe there should be a high school edition of your book in the future. Is there anyone here that would like to ask a question to any of the speakers? I see one hand. I'm coming to you. Just a general remark. Try to ask questions and not make statements. But I think you all know that.
Yes, but you didn't say only ask one question, so can I ask 3?
From now on, that will be.
Okay, I'll be short. I was wondering, I haven't read the book, of course. I'm very curious. I'm a colleague of Hein, actually. I work at the Department of Sociology on welfare states as well. I was wondering, how new is this? I mean, with the development of the welfare state, wasn't it always chauvinistic? There's research, of course, that shows that migration policies became more restrictive when the welfare state developed in the first place. Where's race in this story and racism? And what about excluding citizens? Because this dichotomy between citizens and not, the welfare state always excluded citizens, post-colonial citizens primarily. So I'm also just trying to understand how that plays in this story. Thank you.
Thank you. Gianna, will you do the honors?
Yes, I will start with the answers, and then maybe you can also help a little bit. Yes, so I think also there's research that shows that racism and anti-immigrant policies were always part of the welfare state, but the difference is that it's at the moment at the heart of the political conflicts. So now it's really salient, and we hear about it a lot. So that's why it's so important now to discuss it more, because yes, it becomes more present and also more legitimized, which means it has also the potential to increase. And like we can see now with the growth of the right-wing parties across the continent. And then another thing with the welfare state development that I also write about is that, yes, welfare states are also not always inclusive to other groups, not only migrants, but also lower socioeconomic status groups, like lower educated groups, for example, which is also why I advocate for generally including more vulnerable groups more into like social services, for example, like education, so that everyone has the same opportunities, or at least more similar opportunities in society. And maybe do you want to add?
No,
Yes.
I think I agree with everything you said, and I think one more reason that I think of is that, of course, we have a lot of labor migrants in the European context, and I think also that adds to the debate. So the debate becomes more complicated, like what migrants have access or can have access to what kind of social policies. And then also types of welfare chauvinism differ. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to add to that.
Hein has an idea.
Just very briefly, most has been said already. Yeah, I think it's good that you bring it back more broadly, that the immigration restrictions came up after the First World War, which was also the period indeed when the first sort of welfare state provisions were built up. So these things are indeed related, and you could also say immigration policy is a form of institutionalized exclusion of non-citizens or non-Denisans to all sorts of services. So I think you make a valid point there to broaden that up. And there is some legitimacy to that, in the sense that as part of the modern social contract, I think it is in the way understandable. I think the fallacy, and I think the main reasons why we don't find actually a negative fiscal impact of immigration, is that access to welfare is already not instantaneous, exactly because we have those immigration policies. So partly that rhetoric is actually a fallacy, because we already have made it quite difficult. You have to earn your way into it, with the main exception of asylum seekers. And I think that's where the tension comes in the debate.
And Benjamin, I'm going to include you, because that was the last time we'll have a threefold question. But there was a mention of racism, about the role in welfare socialism, of chauvinism. Would you like to reflect on that?
I'm going to go with the usual answer, which is that I am not like a race expert or migration expert on the topic. However, what I would like to say is that there is indeed like a racial dimension that should not be underestimated. And there are different groups, different people of different ethnicities, and I'm sure that the people here in this room who do research on welfare attitudes will say that there are some differences between groups in terms of access to benefits and services. The one thing that I would like to add that is, I'm sorry, not related to your question, is related also to the fact, and it's also linked to what Gianna said, the fact that welfare chauvinism is becoming increasingly mainstream, and it is a hot topic nowadays because you have mainstream political parties that copy this strategy, thinking that it will get them more votes. But as I argue also in my presentation, it is short-sighted and probably not smart.
Gianna would like to add.
Yes, maybe I can add a little bit more to the racism part, because that's also something we didn't elaborate on. So who is defined as a migrant? And of course, there are also differentiations that are shown in the welfare chauvinism literature. So someone, when we look at, for example, I've done some research now in Germany, and in Germany, the good migrants are maybe the Danish white migrants, but then so there's quite a lot of openness to include these into the welfare systems. But when we look already at Eastern Europe, then the attitudes already change to more negative, and they become even more negative when we go outside of Europe. When we look at migrants with different characteristics, like different skin color, different religion. So there are definitely also hierarchies in that sense, that some people are even more excluded from the welfare state than others. And I think there are also some examples. I think the Dutch child benefit scandal also showed that even having a different last name can already exclude you from the welfare state. So I think there definitely, this element comes in there.
And not just from the welfare state.
Yeah,
just
of course.
Housing in general.
Yeah.
Yes. I have a question here.
Thank you. Thanks for really very interesting presentations. I was really struck by this apparent paradox that on the one hand, welfare chauvinism among the population is not really increasing, but at the same time we do see it in policies and we see it in political rhetoric. And so my question is, to what extent is it actually something that is really elite-driven and top-down? And I'm not only talking about challenger parties who see this as a possibility to cater to certain groups of the population, but also governments that sometimes really have the dilemma, okay, our welfare state expenses are going up. How can we actually sustain this? Well, let's maybe cut out the migrants because they're not going to vote for us, or they're not able to vote for us anyways. So it's a cheap way to actually, distribute the money in a way that you still get to your voters. And I think also from the media, I'm here looking at the journalists, I think it's something that has been taking up a lot when we think of the whole trope of the child benefits. That was 10 years ago, I think, very much, it's Romanians with many children, maybe even Roma, So I think I would be really interested if you have done some research on party queues or also on government interventions that could shed light on that. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting comment, Teresa. I have not done research on parties yet. Of course, what the book does include is the different government contexts. So, for example, how do more exclusive migrant policies influence these attitudes? And there we can also see, again, so these are more what I refer to as more right-wing cultures. And obviously, what governments do, like now in Germany, we have an example where the government tries to introduce a new policy where refugees wouldn't get their money anymore sent to a normal bank account, but to a special card that they can only use in some states, also for certain shops. So even that could be restricted. So, and that money can also not be withdrawn in all of the states. And it can also not be transferred. So they try really to restrict how refugees use their resources, their benefits. And on the one side, they really address with this a lot of the points that we discussed. But what really is what seems to be more, or also the reality, is that these policies are introduced to secure power. And that's what we also already discussed. So a lot of governments nowadays on the national and EU level try to introduce not only more welfare chauvinist, but generally more anti-immigrant policies to supposedly combat the rise of the radical right. But as we know from examples like in the Netherlands, this is not, or this might not be a successful choice, because once you start to focus so much on the immigrant issue, then the people will look at the original parties that they trust with these issues. So
it might even legitimize the topic
definitely.
more.
That's also a problem nowadays. Yeah.
Either of you want to add something to that? It's not obligatory, but I see.
Yeah, I'll just add, because we did conduct a bit of research actually on the topic as part of the Welfare State Futures, Our Children's Europe project, which takes me back to 2015. So we organized some mini publics in 5 different countries. I'll focus just on the British case for now. And within the framework of this project, we first analyzed party manifestos and speeches from different political parties, and then we analyzed the statements that were made by many public participants on the future of the welfare state. And when the topic of migration was being discussed, it was quite astonishing to see that most participants were using the rhetoric of UKIP, so the far-right party of the time, even among those who registered themselves as Labour voters or Liberal Democrat voters. So it shows how powerful the message and the exact policy, even up to the temporary welfare chauvinism example of restricting access to healthcare policy for migrants who have not contributed to taxes for 2 or 5 years, it was mentioned by the participants, and they agreed with that statement. So it shows indeed how the power of top-down statements as such.
Hein?
I would endorse that idea. It's very much top-down driven. What I've also found interesting, we have actually measured 6,500 different policies, not just on migration, but also access to welfare and all these things. And we haven't found any difference between right and left-wing parties. So to me it shows it's mainly about winning the next election. it is not really about cutting all these services, because in terms of policy practice, it is either totally watered down or not much happens, because we have all sorts of, constitutional problems with fundamental exclusion. But I think it's potentially dangerous. If this keeps on becoming the new truth, then of course it can grow into something more dangerous, where some constitutional principles, basic equality principles, will be violated in the future. So I see more the danger in the rhetoric level getting out of hand in a way, and I think that is a real danger. And it's not supported by public opinion research. It's not supported by your book, because in a way, if you think about public opinion, things don't look that gloomy in my view. Yeah, there's always division, but things are not moving in the wrong way, but so far so good, I would say. The fear is where the political narrative takes over, and I think you're right to be worrisome about it.
I see so many questions. I'm going to be able to do one more, and then please stick around if you have more questions, because we will have some drinks served here, and you'll get a chance to speak with our speakers. They'll be hanging out. Please show your hands again who wanted to. I'm sorry, I'm going to go with the one that's closest. I apologize.
Thank you. I had a question about, does industry play a part in the narrative of who's deserving of benefits? If the economy is becoming more white-collar, does that change people's opinion about which migrants should be encouraged, and do those migrants fit a specific profile? And I was reminded of this by an article I read this morning in the Financial Times, that ASML, 40% of their employees are from a migrant background, and so they're quite opposed to some of the policies of Geert Wilders, but they are only speaking about a very specific type of migrant.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have the feeling that I have to respond because you mentioned deservingness, but I haven't done research on that, but all the evidence that there is would point in that direction, right? So that migrants and that's also maybe in response to the racism question. We know that migrants with different characteristics that are more closer to us are more deserving. So that in context, where economic effects play a role, that indeed that affects especially migrants that do not look like us, so to say, and that's more general trend. But about industry policies, I haven't done research to that.
Would you like to add something, Jana?
Yes, so there is some research that looks, for example, at the labor market in Silicon Valley, where you have a lot of highly skilled people, and that relates more to the part about that also the higher educated people can also be anti-immigrant and welfare chauvinists. So because once more migrants get their visas, for example in Silicon Valley, there's some research about that, then also their colleagues get much more anti-immigrant because they see their own position threatened in that context. So I also do some research on welfare chauvinism in more local context, not in industries, but yes, definitely. So the closer to us something happens, the more it affects us, and then we react to it. So that's what I can say about it. So we cannot assume that anyone is that anyone is safe from these type of attitudes, because it's also in the sense natural reactions to protect what you have, and of course then how you react depends on many other factors. But
I'm going to ask one final question, and I hope, I just want to end on a positive note. You've remarked that in some nations, actually, the welfare sovereignty is going down. What is the main reason that it's going down? Or in other words, what's the antidote?
Well, I mean, nu werkt het. Ja, okay. I mean, there's the famous contact hypothesis. I mean, that is the basic explanation that the paradox is that overall attitudes, towards inclusion of migrants into whether it's welfare or other things, tend to become more positive if people are exposed to migrants. So the paradox is that overall opposition against immigration is highest in the countries with very low percentage of immigrants. There are some exceptions. I think Italy stands out in Europe, but overall that's the pattern. And that is the big paradox, that in areas where a lot of migrants live, also within countries, opposition is often generally lower, the sort of harsh anti-immigrant sort of vote, and most people tend to be more, although there's differences, but an important explanation is exactly that. So, onbekend maakt onbemind, we say in Dutch. Unknown makes unloved. That's not a good English translation, but something like that, yeah.
I really like the notion of mentioning the contact hypothesis. So the more contact you have, the more positive attitudes, but it's a little bit more difficult, I think, and I've also done some research on that. So just a lot of exposure to migration, at least from the research that I've done and seen, will actually lead to more negative attitudes. But what's important is positive quality experience and quality contact. So that's what really everything I think is about, that we need quality experiences, quality education, quality services, which requires, of course, more investment and also maybe some more patience. So this text will take a little bit longer, or could take a little bit longer to build, but there are definitely measures that can be taken. Yeah. And of course, that can then maybe combat some of the political rhetorics. Yeah. So there has to be something that is stronger than the rhetorics from...
A good example is perhaps refugees. I mean, there is a sort of vicious circle going on that because asylum seekers have been excluded from work, for instance, it sort of produces the image of asylum seekers not working and benefiting. And if you turn that around and people see that people work, because that's what focus group research also shows, that people are quite positive towards migrants that are working and contributing. But in the same policies exclude certain types of migrants, like asylum seekers, from participating and also paying into the welfare system, in a way reinforce the whole image. So we're stuck in this vicious circle. So I think your propositions are very viable, how you can unstuck that image and reverse that cycle.
All right, thank you so much. Can I please get an applause for our speakers of today? Welfare, chauvinism, how education, economy, and culture shape public attitudes. It's for sale. It's not for sale here. Gianna asked me to mention that the first chapter is online, available for free. And she also arranged for us all to have 50% discount on the book, and you can get the flyer there at the exit, and there you have a QR code where you can get the discounted copy. The cheapest option is to get the online digital version. We have about 30-45 minutes for drinks here. Please stick around, ask questions to our speakers, and have a great evening. Thank you.